Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to, I actually found I had trouble remembering that this is now number 6 webinar. I couldn't remember how many we've done, so I take that as a good sign. I'm Morten Kromberg. Next to me is Brian Becker. We work in the APL tools group at Dyalog, where we work on the tooling that we provide for APL developers. In this webinar, we're going to take a look at source code management, more specifically the new way of doing source code management that we're starting to adopt at Dyalog now and would recommend that you take a look at. That is source code management based on text files and third-party professional source code management tools with names like GitHub and Mercurial and SVN, etc. We're going to start today with a little, we've put together this show where we're going to pretend to be two developers trying to collaborate, and then it's a little bit exciting for us because none of the rehearsals have gone according to plan yet. It's a little bit complicated. Brian's going to start and I'm going to be throwing spanners in the wrench. So Brian.
All right. Well, the first thing I wanted to do is try and set some context. And we develop and modify code, and the code needs to be organized in some fashion. If you're going to try and do version control, if you need to have multiple developers working on the same body of code, it's really important to be able to keep things organized. And of course, you want to test the code and repeat that cycle as much as you need to. And then finally, when the code is ready, we deploy the application and we make it available to our users. Okay, and this is true whether you're a single developer or part of a development group. So in today's agenda, we're going to first run through the application development scenario that Morton mentioned. We're going to modify code, so we're going to save it, we're going to break it, we're going to save it again, we're going to introduce some conflict between two developers, and resolve it and see how that goes. Finally, next we're going to talk about some concepts using a technology or a system called Git and a service called GitHub. And then we're going to go into some details on a utility that we use here to manage our Git repositories called SourceTree. We're going to go into more detail on GitHub. We're going to actually create a repository. Morton's going to introduce a user command called snap to convert a workspace into a set of files that can be stored in a repository. And then finally, we're going to give you a taste of two utilities, user commands that we've developed to build and test Dyalog applications. So, and those two, DBuild and DTest, have already been in use for a while at Dyalog, and we're using it to produce some of the tools that get shipped with the product. So now it's demo time. First thing I want to do is load a workspace of our application, and it's a fairly simple application. It's got a drop-down list of a bunch of different APL functions, and then it's got a slider here to give you basically a function table, a square function table with that many values in the rows and columns, or that many elements in the rows and columns. The code itself is stored in a namespace called app, and the driving function is called FlowMath. It was originally Hello World, but since this is a mathematically based demonstration, we decided to call it FlowMath. And all this does is it does some setup, and it's using a new feature that was introduced with version 16 called the HTML renderer, which is a cross-platform HTML rendering utility that can be run under Windows, under Linux, on the Mac, and to produce GUI user interfaces. And the first thing we do is we use this utility called HTTP request that takes the arguments or the callback arguments from the HTML renderer and formats it into a request where we can extract bits of data. And we're getting form data. We're getting two fields out of the form called fun and max. And then we are calling our function table to produce the outer product table. And then down here toward the bottom, we've just got some stuff to generate some HTML. And we're using a couple of utilities in the UI namespace, one to build a drop-down list, one to build a slider, another one builds an HTML table. And so these utilities just generate the HTML, and they're all pretty simple. Finally, once we have our HTML, we use the HTTP response utility to turn that into a response that's appropriate for the callback for HTML renderer. So that's the extent of our business logic in our application. So
it looks a bit dull.
You always say that. Okay, so let's see if we can. Okay, so let's go into app. FlowMath, and let's introduce a little bit of styling. And fortunately, I mentioned to Adam, who's our CSS expert, that this might be a problem, and he gave me a little snippet of code that I'm just going to cut and paste in here. And this basically just introduces some CSS styling to the application. And so I'll go ahead, and now you notice that I'm getting a prompt here to save the changed code in this file. And so I'm going to go ahead and save the file. And now if we rerun the application, we'll get something that, oh, hang on. What happened? Script follows isn't in here. Now, Morton, I thought script follows was,
Right, that was last night. I'm afraid I cleaned up a little bit.
Okay, well, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and use a utility or a program called SourceTree. That's a GUI to explore and manipulate Git repositories. And sure enough, there's this commitment at Morton that Morton made at 2 a.m. Well, that's Eastern time.
That's your time.
Yeah, so it was only like...
it was this morning.
So, to rename HTML util and UI and remove unused functions. Well, script follows, it was actually a used function. So one of the things I can do is I can go back to an earlier version of the repository and
what happened there?
Well, basically, it's saying that I've got an unsaved change. That if I switch to an earlier version of the repository, I'll lose that change. So, I should have source UI. Let me go ahead and commit this change first of all.
Yeah, I mean the change that you just made to the code you want to keep, right? When
Yeah.
you switch back to an earlier
Yes, I do.
version of the code.
So I'm going to go ahead and commit this change. Add formatting. So I'm adding a little message for the commit, and I'm going to do what's known as staging this change, staging this file. So I'm going to go ahead and commit that. And what this has done is it's basically committed it now to my local repository. Now I'm free to go back in the history and to a point in time before Morton erased script follows. And if I look at the files now, I'll see that my UI namespace is now actually HTML util namespace, and there's script follows. So I'm going to just...
So that completely changed the contents of all of your source folders?
It did?
Just by going back to a previous release in SourceTree?
Yes. And it basically set the current stuff off to the side, brought back the code from this point in history, and I could do that with any of these commits.
Okay.
And so now I'll just save it off in
You can rescue script follows.
I can rescue script files. I'll copy it over to my temp folder. And then I will go back into SourceTree and bring up the latest commit where I added formatting. Now if I go back into total command build, you'll see that HTML util has gone away and UI, the new namespace that you called it, is there. I can go in there and move script follows
From your temporary folder.
from my temporary folder into the new folder, or into the UI folder. And now if I go into SourceTree, I have an uncommitted change, so I've added a new file called script follows. I will go ahead and stage that, what's known as staging. And that basically just queues it up to be committed to my local repository. And so I'll go ahead and say reinstall script follows and go ahead and commit that. So now, having done that, I'm now going to use the DBuild user command to refresh the workspace contents from the source files.
You have a stack there. I think you still have a you need to
Oh,
reset.
yes I do, thank you.
Yeah.
And so if I use DBuild, and now I run quad LX, we should get something that looks more nicely formatted. Is that better?
Cool.
Okay,
It's a bit better. Yeah, some color would be good, but we can do that
for the next one.
another day. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
now, the next thing I'm going to do is these changes have been made to my local GitHub or my local Git repository. And this is actually stored in a repository on my GitHub user ID on GitHub. And so I'm going to push those changes out to the repository and make them public for the world. So, having pushed that,
Yeah.
I now turn it over to Morton.
Okay. So I see there's a comment out there for somebody who's already feeling a little bit lost about what's going on here, and maybe I can try and talk just a little bit more about the structure of what's actually out there. Brian showed you that we have a workspace which has some namespaces in it, and what we're doing, if you can see my screen now, there's this. I'm actually working on a Mac. And I just switched away. This is the screen I want to look at. If you look at this Finder on the Mac, you can see that the various namespaces that are in this workspace are echoed in this folder structure, which is over here. So Hello World is the application, that's the top level. And then we have a folder called Source. Within that we have the root, which contains the start Hello Math function, which starts the whole application. And then inside the application is, for example, this hellomath.dialog function, which Brian showed you in the workspace. If I double click on that and open it with the text editor on the Mac, you can see the source code for this function. So each one of the functions or classes that we're using in this application are mapped one-to-one to files in this folder structure. And the DyalogBuild file, which I was planning to talk about a bit later, but I think maybe it's worth spending a second on now, that Brian ran after he had made changes to the repository to restore files from earlier, is this little file here which has a little bit of metadata at the beginning. It's got an ID and a description and so on. It's got some default values for whenever a namespace is created, what the index origin and migration level should be set to. It allows you to name a workspace name that you might save this as when you're done. And then it has a bunch of statements with an NS label which say create a namespace. There's some a folder path and a wildcard saying where to go and get the source, and a target namespace to load those into. So this DyalogBuild file, which is used by the DBuild command, generates the workspace from these structures. So I'm on the Mac. I hope that helped a little bit. Otherwise, send some more questions, and if we can, we'll try and answer them. So I'm in SourceTree on the Mac, and I've heard that Brian has been doing some work. So I'm going to ask to refresh the remote status. And why is it not? There we go. Takes a little bit of time. So there's this commit here I see, which has the comment reinstall script follows by Brian a few minutes ago. And I can see, if I click on it here, I can see that down here with the mouse, I don't know whether the mouse cursor is visible, but down in the left side, we've got script follows.dialog. I can see the green plus tells me it was added. And if I click on it, I can see the contents of it. If I go down and look at one of the earlier, let's see, the Mac scrolls the other way. If I go down to something I was working on 2 days ago, I can see that there were 2 files that were changed. If I click on each one, I can see in a little window down on the right-hand side the difference. You can see this red line was removed and the green line was added. So SourceTree is able to diff, as they say, APL source files as long as they are Unicode files stored as UTF-8. Right, so I now also have a red pull here, which tells me that there are commits that I should pull. Brian did 2 commits. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and bring this down onto my Mac, which updates the files, the source files in the folder. If I now go and just run the dbuild command, I already did that a moment ago, but that was with source code which is now out of date. If I just say dbuild again, it reruns that, and I should now have the latest changes. And with a bit of luck, this will work on a Mac, although it doesn't come to the front. There it is. So you see I have the styled, I have Brian's nicely styled version of this. Right, so Brian and Adam are working on the styling. I work in the math department and on the business logic. And I've had a request from a user to add the logarithm function to our tables. So I happen to remember that in app function list, there's a little variable containing what ends up in that drop down, and I'm going to add logarithm to it. These files that have been loaded using salt have a link back to the source, so the system knows this is the file function list dialog. I say yes, I want it updated there. If I go back to SourceTree and wait a few seconds, I now have an uncommitted changes, and if I click on this, we can see down here that there's a logarithm in green and there isn't one in red. So my job is done. I'm going to stage that. I'm going to commit it. Added logarithm, and I'm going to tell Brian that the job is done, and he can go and pick it up and give me the next task.
Okay, so Morton has now told me that he's updated things, and I now have a commit that's out on GitHub on the remote repository that I need to pull down to my local repository. And so if I click on pull, it will go ahead and put those in here, or download the updates. And again, I can look in the log history, and I can see that the description of this commit is added logarithm. I can see that the file functionlist.dialog changed, and I can see the changes. So I can see those same changes in SourceTree on Windows as that Morton can on the Mac. So now I'll go ahead and go back to the workspace, and refresh the contents using DBuild. And I just want to use the testing framework called DTest to see, just to see if everything's working. And we've got a domain error. Okay, so right now DTest just on any error just fails and it doesn't give you any more details. But if I call it with a parameter of -halt, it will stop at the point where the error occurred. And so I can see here that F, so F is logarithm, and I guess that, well, when Morton added logarithm to the code, he didn't remember that one log something is going to produce a domain error. So Morton, can you fix that?
I'm busy.
You're busy, oh, okay. Well, all right. I'll just do it. Okay, let's see. I guess I'll just put in a handler here that if we get an error, any error, we'll just replace it with exclamation points.
Just remembered I was supposed to create a branch there, but I think it's just as well I didn't because we're running late.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save my changes and update my source file. And in the meantime, you didn't fix it. Oh, yes, you did.
Yes, I did.
Okay, so
I told you
now
I was busy.
yes. So now, one of the things that you should do when you're using Git is to pull changes down from the remote repository before you push anything else up.
Just in case somebody else did something.
Just in case something else. Well, you want to be working with the latest code. And so now I get an error message here. It says, okay, the changes to my local file function table.dialog would be overwritten if I pull this down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, do the same thing twice because I can never, I'm always tempted to click OK and I never click cancel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and commit my code fixed function table, and I'm going to commit it, and I get another error, and it says the updates were rejected because my current branch is behind. And I'll get a little message here that says my commit succeeded, which meant that the code, my change was posted to my local repository, but I can't push it out to the remote repository because we've got a conflict. Morton and I have edited the same function. So I can take a look at function table. If I do a DBuild to refresh my content, and I look at app.function table.
I think you need to do a pull.
Oh, I need to do the pull again. You're right.
Yeah,
yep.
You need to do.
Yes,
It's
I
a
tried
little
to push.
bit funky how that works. You need to do the pull again, and that pull will do the merge to the best of its.
Yes.
It can't actually do the merge, but it's going to. It's going to do what it can, right?
So now if I refresh the workspace and I now look at app.function table, we've now got Morton's modifications and my modification merged. And what Git does is that it inserts these lines here that basically show you where the difference is, and then I have to figure out how to resolve it. And my change here underneath this line that says a bunch of less than's head, that's my change. Then under the equals line is Morton's change. And so I can go ahead and edit this now, and I will compromise. I will use Morton's oof with my exclamation point, and
This is only because we edited the exact same line of code, right? If
Yes.
we edited 2 different lines of code,
It would just merge it.
it would just have merged the changes into the same function without a complaint. It's because, I mean, I don't know exactly what its limitations are, but it tends to get it right all the time, except when you've just edited exactly the same line of code, in my experience.
So now I'm going to stage this, and notice that the comment, SourceTree has actually generated a comment here that says that there were conflicts, and one of the things I'll do is I'll just say we resolved those here, and go ahead and push that up to GitHub. Okay.
Okay, so now if I, well, do I need to do pull? No, I guess we're done with that.
Okay, so the next thing is we're going to distribute a release of our application now. And to do that, I'm going to use DBuild again, but I'm going to use the production flag. And what this is going to do is for the code that it brings in from file, the production flag will unlink it from the source file. So that if you try and edit one of the functions here, the file that it's associated with on my machine obviously doesn't exist on your machine, so it won't. You won't get a file not found error. So now that I've created the production workspace, I can go ahead and save it. And now I will go out, and this will make the saved workspace is now an unstaged file. I will stage it, and I will commit it. So we're going to say version 1.0, and I'll commit it and push it out to GitHub. And now I'm going to go out to GitHub itself and go to my Hello World repository, and you can see that we've got 29 commits, and the last one was what I'm calling version 1.0. So I want to go ahead and create a release. Okay. So I'm going to create a new release, and I'm going to call this version 1.0. And the release title is going to be our first release, exclamation point. Now I could also add more documentation here about how to download it or install it or whatever. I want to take the workspace itself. Yep.
Yeah, so you can attach a binary to a release like that, which could be an executable, or in this case a workspace. And I guess if you do that, you really shouldn't be pushing the workspace to the repository, because the repository is really designed for text-based source code, and it knows how to deal with that.
Right.
But it's still quite common for people to upload binaries.
Well, part of the reason for doing this is we may still want to put the binary in the repository, but now I've clicked the publish release, and we have this. But one of the things you'll notice now is in the download section, we can get all of the source code for this release, either as a zip file or as a tarred file. But we also have the workspace that you can just click on and download by itself. And so I think there's some advantage to that, even if the workspace is also stored in the repository. But in practice, it just is a waste of space.
Right. So we have no idea how enthusiastic people are out there about this. But assuming that there are some people at least who would like to try this out, how do they get started?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked. So Git is a free version control system. It runs everywhere, and including on the Pi. Your application is stored in a Git repository, and it has a command line interface, but there are also a lot of GUI clients that are available. And the one we happen to use is called SourceTree. And GitHub is a Git repository hosting service. You can make a repository public so that anyone can see it. You can have private repositories, but if you want private repositories on GitHub, it's a $7 a month cost for unlimited private repositories. And then for any of your repositories, you can decide who can collaborate and contribute code to the repository. Now, GitHub isn't the only service for hosting Git repositories. There are others. There's Bitbucket and a few others. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss is sort of to describe what we've been doing in terms of the Git workflow. So our working directory is the set of folders where our application code lives, where those text files are stored. And then we modify code or we add files and to what's known as the staging area. And then you commit from the staged area to your local repository. And then if you're using a remote repository like GitHub, then you push, and that goes into your remote repository. Conversely, going in the other direction, if you want to grab updates from the remote repository, use the pull command to move those down to your local repository. And then you can do things like called checkout or merge to take different branches of development and make those your active files that you're working on.
So not all of these systems have the distinction between the local and the remote repository, right? That's one of the reasons why Git has become so popular, that it allows you that distinction.
Yeah, well, also a remote repository doesn't have to be on GitHub. It could be on your machine. So it's something that, if you're working on an intranet in an organization, you can have distributed repositories all over the place. And
but when you're working on your machine, you have the entire history of the repository available to you.
Absolutely.
So you can do all of that work offline without connecting to a server.
Yep.
And you only push the stuff up when you want to share it with somebody.
Yeah, there are some other version control systems like Subversion where the repository is more centralized and everybody pushes and pulls off of that, and you need to be connected to it to do work. So just to clarify a few concepts, commits. A commit is just a snapshot of your code at a point in time. And you can, you modify or add to your code, and then you stage some subset of those modifications. And then when you commit your stage modifications, that writes them into the local repository and basically creates that snapshot. The next thing we wanted to talk about, and we didn't get to it in the demo, is branches. And everything is a branch in Git. So the default branch is called master. And a branch basically creates an alternate development path or environment. And branches can be used for new development, for bug fixes, for experiments, and
I screwed up that in the demo. The intention was that when I made the change to the list of functions, I was going to create a branch so that the development of the business logic would be on a separate branch from the enhancements to the look and feel. And then when everything was okay and we'd done the tests and so on, we would merge them back in again. So it allows not necessarily groups of people. You could use branches for your own work. If you have two things that might need to be apart for a while before coming back together again, you would use a branch.
Yep. So here's a little diagram that I found that talks about, so here's the master branch, and then you can do, so here's a branch for some sort of a hot fix. A bug got reported and you want to try and prioritize that and turn that out quickly. Then you've got a release branch, which is basically where you're going to create your official releases from. And then you've got a development branch, which may have separate branches for features. And so all of these, anytime that you have an arrow that comes from a line, those are branches, so you can branch from a branch. And then anytime you have a line that goes, an arrow that goes to a line, that's where you're merging that particular branch back into another branch.
Right, and that's, with branches, that's the same operation as when two people have been working and merge things back into a single branch.
Yep.
It brings a collection of commits at the same time together.
So, speaking of remote repository, again, the remote repository is just a repository that's somewhere else. It can be on another person's machine, It can be on a hosting service. One of the things I wanted to talk quickly about, especially if anybody wants to pick up code that Dyalog has developed that we store on GitHub, there are a few ways to do that. One is you can download a zip file, and that basically makes a copy of a specific branch and commit without copying the underlying Git metadata. And any change that you make will be in place and won't have any revision history. It's basically just a set of files. It's not actually a Git repository at that point. You can clone a repository. And what that does is it makes a copy of the repository on your local machine with all of that metadata. And so this can be used for collaborative development. This is what Morton and I have been doing with the Hello World application. But you need the owner of the repository's permission to make changes. Finally, you can do what's known as fork a repository, which makes a copy of the repository under your GitHub ID. And so if, for instance, you see a repository that's interesting and you want to experiment with it and maybe make some other modifications without having your modifications be pushed back to the source or the original repository, you can fork it, and then you basically own your own copy of it. And then if you want to take some of your changes and suggest that they be incorporated into that original repository, you can make what's known as a pull request, where the original owner can then look at the pull request and then decide whether they want to incorporate it or not into their repository. So just for more information, for Git, there's some really good tutorials on the Atlassian. They are the makers of SourceTree. They've got some very good Git tutorials. And then Syncfusion, it turns out, has ebooks that are free, and they've got good ones on both Git and GitHub. So what I'd like to do now is to go to a clean Windows machine. And this is a virtual machine running on my desktop here, and show you the process of going enrolling in GitHub and installing SourceTree. How are we doing on time?
We're fine, I think.
Okay. So the first thing is, let me log out of
Depending on how long it takes.
GitHub here. Okay, so when you go to github.com, you'll be presented with this screen. And if you don't already have a GitHub ID, you're going to want to sign up. And you're going to select a username. You're going to give it an email address and a password. And that's basically all there is to it. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to create yet another GitHub ID. But that's the process that you go through there. Then if you want to get SourceTree, you go out to sourcetreeapp.com, and you can download it for Windows or for Mac OS 10. And I've already downloaded it here, but I haven't installed it on this virtual machine. This is why I have a virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and run the setup and walk you through the process of installing SourceTree. And because this is on a virtual machine, the performance is a little sluggish, but hopefully it'll be tolerable. The awkward silence.
Yeah, it's really hard to sit here and have to look into the camera and not be allowed to look over and see what you're doing.
So, so here I'm going to agree to the.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say now I have an existing Atlassian account. You can, if you don't have an account with Atlassian, you can go to click on this button and enroll, but I have an existing account, so I'm going to go ahead and use that.
Yeah, I just seen there's a question from Norbert about snap and bracket save, and we will have time to do a snap. So as soon as Brian's finished setting up a new repository, I'm going to populate it using that. So we'll get to that.
Okay, so now I've registered. I'm going to continue. Now you can connect to a remote account, and you'll notice here that it's got a if you already have a Bitbucket account or a GitHub account, you can use that. And since I have a GitHub account, I will go ahead and enroll that. So the authentication, when you've gone through the GitHub sign up, the authentication that you'll use will be basic, and it'll be your username and password. And my username happens to be BP Becker, and I can never remember my password. Hopefully this is it. All right.
There's another question I've seen. There's a question about a minimum level for Dyalog to use Git. And the answer is any recent version will support SALT, the bracket save and bracket load that are the foundations of this. But the DTest and the DBuild and the snap commands that are used for this have been evolving significantly in the last few releases. In fact, in this AppHello World repository, there's a new copy of a DyalogBuild folder containing the build and test user commands that, if you want to replicate exactly what we've done today, you will need to download and install. There's I don't know, is my screen visible? Can it for a split second before Brian continues? So there's a DTest folder, there's a dbuild.dialog which contains the definition of test and build, and there's a README which explains what to do with it. So if you want to replicate exactly what we've been doing here today, trying to follow the webinar, you should download and install that. Sorry, back to Brian.
Okay, so I finished the SourceTree installation. One of the things it asked me was, did I want to clone an existing repository, and I decided not to. I'm actually going to create a new repository here. So I'm going to click over here on New Repository, and I'm going to call it HW2 for Hello World 2. And it's going to be the new and improved Hello World. And I'm going to make this a public repository. And I'm going to initialize it with a README file, which is basically just a short description. And then one of the things that is generally a good idea is to add some sort of a license to your code that basically tells people how they can use your code, whether they can use it for commercial purposes, private, non-commercial use, are there any waivers of liability and things like that. And the license that we like to use, or that I like to use, is called the unlicense, which basically says you're free to do whatever you want with this code, but whatever you do, I'm not responsible. And I'm going to go ahead and create the repository. And so you see that I've now got my repository. It's got two files in here, a license file and a README file. And now I will turn it over to Morton. Oh, first of all, I can't turn it over to Morton.
You have to give me access.
Yes. So I go into Settings now, and I'm going to go click on Collaborators, and I'm going to add people that I want to be able to access and modify this repository. In this case, I'm going to add Morton. So you can type in their username. I click Add Collaborator. This will send an email message out to Morton telling him that he's been invited to collaborate on this repository. I can also copy a link here that I could send to Morton via instant messenger or however, and he could click that to basically accept the invitation.
It is done.
Okay.
I will try and click on it. I accept your invitation. I had to do that on a separate machine that you can't see, unfortunately. I don't have my instant messenger application installed on the MacBook. Okay, so I now need to get hold of this. I need to clone this repository. So File, New Clone, clone from a URL. Let's see, https://github.com/bpbecker/hw2. Yep. And I'm happy with the default destination path, so I'll go ahead and clone that. And now if I go to the Finder, I'll see that I have this folder called hw2, which just has the license and the README. Have a look at the license. Okay, that looks good. In the meantime, I actually went to the release that you made of FlowMath, and I downloaded the binary there, the workspace, and I've loaded that. So what I'm going to try and do now is, I mean, it's a bit stupid since I could just copy the repository, but as an exercise to show how you would take a heritage APL system, I think the correct terminology is, and put it, snap it using the snap user command. So snap is something that was created some years ago, and it's actually intended to both take all of the functions and classes and so on in a workspace and put them into text files. And it's also designed to build a function that brings them all back. Now we're not going to be using the latter functionality, we're just going to be snapping stuff into the folders, and then we're going to be using our DBuild script to build it again, because I like that better. So I'm going to say snap into users mcrom hw2, make any necessary folders that are not already there, and I'm going to start by saying only snap the stuff called tests, because the tests folder has a slightly different why is that? Oh, that's because it's users. There we go. So if we have a look at Finder, we'll see that now we have a tests folder created. And then the rest of it, I just want to go into the source. I still want to make dir, but now I don't want a pattern. The way snap works is it's only going to snap things that haven't already been snapped. So the test stuff that has been snapped will now be ignored, and it's going to snap, since I didn't give it a pattern to filter what was there, it's going to snap everything else and create a folder structure identical to the structure of the workspace. Now this hasn't given us exactly what I want, because first of all, Snap has created all these files called name.txt, which are part of this mechanism that it has for rebuilding the workspace, and I don't want those. It's actually important at the moment that you delete them, because there's a little bug somewhere that we will fix soon. But again, if you want to try and recreate this, it's important that you delete those folders. And it's created a source tests folder, which it hasn't put anything into, because it saw that there was a namespace there, and even though everything in it had been snapped, it felt it needed to create that structure. So now I have something which is almost the same as what we had before, except the stuff that's at the root level in source, the HTTP utils and the start hello math functions are just lying there in the source folder, and I actually want to have a new folder under source, which I'm calling root, and I want those two functions in there. So, you know, Snap does a pretty good job of creating all the files that we need, but not exactly the structure that we're looking for here. The very last thing I need to do is to get hold of my DyalogBuild file, copy that, and I need to put that into here. There we go. And according to the convention, to work in the default way without me having to name anything, it needs to have the same name as the... So now if I open this thing, you can see it's a DyalogBuild file. It says how to deal with these 4 namespaces that I have. And if I go back to APL and clear everything out and say DBuild users mcrom hw2, it brings everything in, and if I say start hello math, I hopefully get oh, I downloaded an older version of it. Sorry, I didn't pick up the new prettified version. But anyway, so that's how I would go about, you know, if instead of having this all in scripts to begin with, I started with something which was a workspace with this namespace structure, I can use snap and with a little bit of hand massaging get it into the structure that I want. The last bit that you used briefly to find out that I had screwed up, the DTest, is something that we don't really have time, we didn't really expect to have time, and probably we need to run maybe the next webinar in a month or the one in 2 months. We'll talk in more detail about DBuild and DTest. But very simply, if I just type DTest, it says two tests passed in 0 seconds, and that's because what it's done is it's looked inside, it looked to see if there's a namespace called tests, and it's looked for anything in there with a name beginning with test underscore something, and it's run it. And if I want to see a little bit more closely, I'll spend another 30 seconds on this, and then I'm done. I'll say DTest minus trace, and what will happen then is it'll put a stop on the first line of every function, and we can see that I really have some rather silly tests. I have one where I call this drop down to create a drop down containing A, B, C, and D, E, F, and I run the result of that through .xml. I get an XML structure, and then I have some validation of the contents of that to satisfy myself that the UI function to create drop downs is working. That's fine. And then we have the one that failed for Brian, the test function table, where we for every function in the list we run around, we create a function table of size 15, and we check the result is of size 16 by 16, which is a bit stupid, but we're trying to show the principles here rather than write a useful application. So I think that's all we had, really.
Yeah.
A few minutes still left to go to 5 o'clock. I don't know if anybody's still out there and has some more questions. If you thought that was interesting, send questions now or send them in later. As Brian said to begin with, these DBuild and DTest are still prototypes. They're things that we're working on. We're using them ourselves. When we were working over the last few days to put this workshop together, we discovered that although they worked fine for the precise cases we were using in the tools group, there were some things we wanted to do for the demo here that they didn't quite support, and that's why in the project there's a new version of the user command file, and we'll make sure that, I don't know exactly when, around the new year there'll be a new release of user commands containing this update. Until then, you can download them from the repository. That's BP Becker Hello World at the moment. Maybe we'll put them somewhere more obvious. There'll be a link. I'm turning to Jason now to ask him, are we able to associate materials with the webinar?
Not anymore, but we can put it in the description.
Okay, so we'll put if you go back to the description of this webinar in a day or so, there'll be a link telling where to get the materials. Okay, so this is where we take an awkward break to see if there are any more questions. Is anybody still there? So it was all clear, crystal clear. All totally Everyone's totally foxed.
Or confused.
Yes, it's either completely clear or...
Since this is recorded, you can replay it in slow motion and try to step through things. One of the things we really wanted to do was to get through the, creating a repository, downloading SourceTree, so that people would see exactly how to do that. And hopefully the rest of it was somewhat interesting. There's a question. Right, so there's a question saying, so you can use Snap today. I showed it briefly. It creates a folder structure, and then it creates a boot function that reads everything back in. I believe the salt boot function that's created has about a line for each function that's or each object that's salted. So it's a very, very long function that's created, and I'm hoping that DBuild is going to be something that's easier to use, or much simpler to use. We actually have a project ongoing that's supposed to be finished, early next year, certainly in time for version 17, where the goal is really to be able to, without really any lines in your DBuild file, have a one-to-one relationship, as far as that makes sense, between a workspace and a folder. So you'll have a folder structure that exactly matches your namespaces, and that's going, both snapping that or creating it from a workspace and loading it is something that we'll be looking at really optimizing so that it runs fast.
Yeah, the goal is to provide functionality and utilities that are going to make working with code in files completely natural and transparent. You won't even need to think about it. And we're not there yet, but we're getting there.
Yeah. I mean, for example, I didn't answer the second part of Jürgen's question about DTest. So the point here is that if you have a folder structure, if we go back to here, we've got tests, right? I've just got 2 files in here. Each one is a test. If I just create another, I can just put another function in there. The function needs to return an empty vector if everything is fine, or an error message if the test fails. And then the DTest framework will run all the functions in there. There are various switches to select only running certain functions and so on. So the idea is to make it really, really easy to create a folder full of unit tests, or several different folders to test different things. Right, so Phil asks, will DBuild also make changes to my functions as Snap does? And I'm not sure exactly what that question means. I mean, DBuild is the mechanism that brings stuff into the workspace. If you've used Snap to create the source files, it will have done whatever Snap does. I don't know. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a lag, so it'll take a little while before Phil can respond to what changes are made. I mean, ideally, there should be no changes to your code when you use this. We're also in the middle of, while we wait for Phil, hopefully he's typing, we're in the middle of a transition where, I mean, Salt was created, I think, nearly 10 years ago, and was implemented in APL using APL code that read all the source files using APL code. Since version 15, the APL interpreter has been becoming able to do many of the things that Salt has done, and maintain links to source files and so on. One of the interesting bonuses of that is that when the interpreter is doing, you get to a position where your source code is preserved exactly as typed. So the interpreter doesn't bring the source into the workspace, but if you edit a function that's been brought in by the interpreter, you will see the source code in the file rather than the slightly tweaked version that the interpreter uses internally. Anything from Phil?
Yes.
The screen isn't updated.
That's the same question as before.
Well, not on my screen.
Yeah. So it's 5 o'clock. So I mean, for people who have to go now, thank you very much for watching, but we will carry on for a little bit as long as there are questions. There's still no change to the...
What's the question?
There's a funny line at the bottom that interferes with code that looks at the quad CR, which I...
Oh, that's the salt comment.
bug. There's two things. One is there's as you bring code into the workspace using salt, salt adds a line at the end of the function containing a CRC and various other tidbits of information. As we transition to the interpreter doing that linking, that will all go away. And DBuild will be using the latest technology. So DBuild as you have it today will add that line of code. But it disappears, I mean, it's not there in the source files. When they get written back to the file, it's removed again. Once we get to the point where the interpreter is doing all of this, there will be nothing. Right, so there's another question from Norbert as to, I guess this is whether the interpreter will start watching the source folders. And that is certainly, I have seen that on a to-do list. Exactly when we'll do that, I don't know. But that would be good. Though, of course, there's some cost associated with that. If you, that'll certainly be something you want to switch on and off, whether you're in development mode and you actually want file system watchers on all your source folders. Yeah, I mean, there's a comment that to do that would need file system hooks watching the source folders, and that's correct. That is something we would hope to do. I can't say exactly when. What is the effect on Quad AT, asks Ray Cannon. So Quad AT, for those who don't know, is a metadata function that you can call. You can get information about the user ID and the timestamp that last made the change to a file. If you are using Salt can be configured to store this information in the file. In that case, you get a funny little trailing line in the source file as well, where Salt has added that information. I think in the longer term, though, our position is that that's what Git does. If you want to find out who changed something, you should be looking in Git rather than in the workspace. I realize some APL users will see that as a step backwards, but I think most people coming to APL would see that as quite natural. Git and all the other similar tools have very powerful tools for drawing graphs of who changed things historically and stuff like that. And it's better to leave that to the people who really do that for a living. It's wonderful that APL can now hook into all those things. Okay, Guy asks whether it's possible to use the utility for any repository. Yes, I mean there are two separate steps here that we're talking about. One is that APL can use these folders on your machine, like the one that's on my screen now. I'm not sure if it's visible, but a folder containing text files. So APL's ability to update that is the one stage. And then there are a bunch of tools like Git, like SVN, Mercurial, Microsoft has tools, CVS, Visual Studio has tools to do that. All of those tools should be able to use a folder containing text files in exactly the same way. So I think the answer to that is yes. No more questions. So we'll do another awkward minute. unless people are, you can see people are fading away.
Not many.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be making an announcement about the next date. It'll be early January, first half of January. So follow us on Twitter, Facebook, etc. Thank you very much.